way, there are good people on both sides of the aisle. There are good people in chambers. Even in the entire police reform bill, that also kind of ended up where it's at. Hakeem Jeffries, Karen Bass, I think originally they were all a little like, what's the rural guy from North Dakota doing talking about police reform in a way that sounds realistic? And the reason is because I did it here. You know, we redid our school zone laws in North Dakota. We redid our minimum mandatories. We created misdemeanor classifications for certain drug possession crime. And the reason is we always talk about prison and over-incarceration and all of those things. Well, you know what we don't talk about? The over-felonization of 20-year-old offenders. Because when my dad was in college, if you got a felony when you were 20 years old because you got into a bar fight in Dickinson, North Dakota, you could move to Wisconsin and start your life over. You can't do that anymore. The internet and technology has created a lot of really cool things, but you can't outrun your past. And so we talk about incarceration. I'm telling you, if you're 20 years old and you have a felony on your record, and I don't care if it's a deferred imposition of sentence or not, your life path is immediately altered. And so when you're dealing with young adults and addiction-related offenses, I think it behooves us to figure out a way how to make them better members of society and not better criminals. But I also will stand up every single day and talk about, hey, in your quest to solve something in downtown Minneapolis, you better recognize how that works 40 miles northwest of Williston on the side of the road. Because we measure back up in hours, not minutes. And we tend to have an ability, when we try to regulate from the federal government, we forget those people. And we forget how that works. And we forget that small community law enforcement has a hard enough time recruiting. And if you are going to jack up localities, because you're not suing a cop. No offense, but cops don't go into that profession for money. They work shift work, so it's hard for their spouse to work, especially if they have kids. So who are you ending up suing? Well, you're suing the municipality, right? Or the county, or the city, because that's how it'll work. And if we're trying to recruit cops out to North Dakota with more of that liability, we're going to have to offer to pay them. And the other problem is when you talk about an excessive force case, it doesn't matter the race or the gender of the offender, and it doesn't matter the race or the gender of the enforcement officer. Every civil rights case, or every excessive force case is a civil rights case, every one. And the other problem is it's always based on reasonableness, which means it never settles before trial. It's a question of fact for the jury. So if we're going to talk about qualified immunity, and I think we should, by the way, you have to recognize that an entire sue and settle market will develop overnight on this. And what it'll end up doing in rural communities is it will shut down the police force. They'll just turn it over to the county. Smaller towns with 4 or 5 law enforcement officers, real small towns with only 1 law enforcement officer, won't exist anymore. I mean, that's what will happen. So when we are talking about policy changes, we should be reasonable, we should be thoughtful, and we should figure out how to do it. De-escalation training for everybody is a good idea. I mean, regardless of what the racial makeup of the community is, we have more mental health, we have more addiction issues than ever. Training any law enforcement officer for more de-escalation training, I'm all for it. I don't care if you're in Williston or New York or anywhere. The problem is when you're a department of 3 people and you're trying to mandate a federal requirement of 18 hours of training by a certified trainer somewhere. Well, what happens to your department for those 18 hours when you're grouping people to send them somewhere to get trained? Because I'm just telling you, Belfield, North Dakota isn't going to develop that program. So they're going to have to go somewhere else. So there's 2.3 million people incarcerated in the United States. 2 million of them are in state and local. Federal solutions to this get very difficult. And they get really difficult if you're going to do it without putting in what I like to refer to as unfunded mandates that are really, really difficult for smaller communities to do. But you're not without hope, by the way. States all over the country, Democrat, Republican, rural, urban, liberal, conservative, have been doing criminal justice reform in various different ways. States like North Dakota, states like Texas, states like Colorado. New Jersey has one of the most, I think, aggressive and smart bond review programs in the entire country. Started by Chris Christie, but really truly implemented by, I can't remember his name, but he's a Democratic governor. So it's bipartisan. It's worked through. But I will argue that there's a difference between New Jersey and New York. New York's pretrial release program is swung the pendulum too far, and it's going to swing back. New Jersey does it based on risk and aversion and not money, but they do a real metric on risk. And so if you can post $1 million bond, that doesn't mean you're getting out of jail, because you meet a metric where they're saying your likelihood of appearance at trial or your risk to the community is too high. But if you can't post 50 cents in bond and your metric is below a risk to the community and they think you're going to appear at your next court appearance, they'll let you out. So there are ways to do this. But the ways to do it are to get guys, and I've talked to some of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, we should go on a roadshow. We should go talk to local municipalities and legislators, because they account for 99% of the law enforcement in the country. And so let's go deal with it. Let's have the conversation. Let's discuss it. And I have represented minority clients in North Dakota all across the state, but I don't have any knowledge base of what it's like to be a minority and be pulled over by a cop. So I'm not going to pretend to have that emotional reaction or that generational reaction. That's not what I'm in this for. I'm in it for saying, being smart on crime is not being soft on crime. And doing these things and allowing things to deal with those things. We talk a lot about community policing in large cities, and I think it's a huge idea. And the reason I think it's a huge idea is whether we do it or not, we all do it in North Dakota. Community policing is just what we do. We live in these communities. Everybody knows everybody. We deal with that. Our law enforcement Dickinson's at every United Way thing. They're at all of these different things. And so the interactions are very, very